The November wind cut across the Wyoming territory like a rusty knife, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Martha Henderson pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her swollen belly as the supply wagon lurched over another frozen rut in the trail. Each jolt sent a sharp pain through her back, reminding her that her time was drawing near, too near for comfort in this desolate landscape. "Fort Bridger's just over that ridge, ma'am," called out Jake Morrison, the grizzled wagon driver who'd taken pity on her in South Pass City. His weathered face showed concern as he glanced back at his passenger. "You sure you got folks there who'll take you in?" Martha's hand instinctively moved to protect her unborn child from another jarring bump. The truth was, she had no idea what awaited her at Fort Bridger. Her husband Thomas had mentioned a cousin stationed there, Sergeant William Henderson, but that was before the mine collapse that had taken Thomas's life and left her with nothing but debts and this child growing inside her. "I'll manage," she replied, though her voice betrayed the uncertainty she felt. At 22, Martha had already buried her parents and now her husband. The baby would be all the family she had left in this world. The landscape around them was unforgiving. Rolling hills covered in brittle grass, scattered stands of cottonwood trees with their leaves long since fallen, and in the distance, the snow-capped peaks of the Winter Mountains. This was Shoshone country, and Martha had heard the stories whispered in the mining camps about raids and skirmishes. The very thought made her stomach clench with more than just the familiar pangs of hunger. As they crested the hill, Fort Bridger spread out below them like a collection of weathered wooden blocks scattered across the valley floor. The stockade walls looked sturdy enough, and smoke rose from several chimneys, promising warmth. But what caught Martha's attention was the unusual gathering outside the main gates, dozens of horses, both cavalry mounts and Indian ponies, and men in blue uniforms standing alongside figures in buckskin and feathers. "Well, I'll be," Jake muttered, pulling back on the reins to slow their approach. "Looks like there's some kind of powwow going on. Haven't seen Shoshone this close to the fort in months." Martha felt her heart skip. She'd heard about the tensions between the army and the local tribes, about Chief Running Bear, who some called a savage, and others called a man of honor trying to protect his people. The idea of arriving in the middle of such a gathering filled her with dread, but she had nowhere else to go. As their wagon drew closer, she could make out the details more clearly. The soldiers stood in formation near the gates, their rifles at the ready, but not raised. Across from them a group of Shoshone warriors sat mounted on their horses, their leader, a tall man with graying hair and proud bearing, clearly in command. Between the two groups, a small cluster of officers and what appeared to be tribal elders were engaged in animated discussion. "That'll be Chief Running Bear," Jake said, nodding toward the mounted leader. "Been trying to negotiate safe passage for his people through these parts for the winter hunting. Army's been none too cooperative from what I hear." The wagon wheels crunched over the frozen ground as they approached the main gate. A young private rushed forward, his hand resting nervously on his sidearm. "State your business," he called out, though his eyes kept darting toward the tents gathering nearby. "Got a lady here looking for Sergeant William Henderson," Jake replied. "She's kin and she's in a family way." Martha tried to straighten up in the wagon seat, fighting against the exhaustion that had been her constant companion for weeks. The movement sent another sharp pain through her abdomen, stronger this time, and she had to grip the wooden seat to keep from crying out. The private's expression softened slightly when he saw her condition. "Sergeant Henderson's my commanding officer, ma'am, but he's in the middle of something important right now." He gestured toward the council gathering. "Please," Martha managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've come so far, and I have nowhere else to go." The desperation in her voice must have reached him, because the private nodded and turned toward the gathering. "Sergeant Henderson!" he called out. "You got family here?" The interruption caused heads to turn throughout both groups. A middle-aged man in a sergeant's uniform broke away from the discussion and jogged toward the wagon. His face was weathered by years on the frontier, but Martha could see Thomas's eyes in his features, the same warm brown eyes that had made her fall in love with her husband. "Good Lord," he breathed as he approached the wagon. "You must be Martha. Thomas wrote about you, but I never expected—" His gaze fell to her swollen belly, and understanding dawned on his face. "When did he—" "3 weeks ago," Martha replied, her voice breaking slightly. "Cave in at the mine. I had nowhere else to turn." William Henderson's face hardened with grief and determination. "You come with me, girl. We'll get you settled proper." He reached up to help her down from the wagon, But as Martha tried to stand, the world suddenly tilted sideways. The stress of the journey, the poor food, and the constant worry had finally taken their toll. "I'm sorry," she whispered, as her knees buckled and darkness closed in around her. Mansi was a chapter 2, an unexpected intervention. Martha's collapse sent ripples of commotion through the assembled crowd. Sergeant Henderson caught her before she could hit the ground, her unconscious form seeming impossibly fragile in his arms. The baby's weight was evident even through her worn dress, and William's face paled as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Get the post surgeon!" he barked at the nearest soldier, but Private Collins shook his head grimly. "Doc Patterson's been called to treat wounded from yesterday's patrol, Sergeant. Won't be back till tomorrow at the earliest." The news hit like a physical blow. William looked down at Martha's pale face, feeling helpless in a way that years of frontier warfare had never made him feel. Around them, the tension of the interrupted council meeting still hung in the air, but all eyes were now focused on the drama unfolding at the fort's entrance. Chief Running Bear had dismounted and was walking slowly toward the group gathered around Martha. His weathered face showed concern rather than the stoic indifference that most whites expected from him. At 45, he carried himself with the dignity of a man who had led his people through countless hardships, but there was something in his dark eyes, as he looked at the unconscious woman, that spoke of a deeper understanding of loss. "Your medicine man is not here?" he asked in carefully measured English, his deep voice cutting through the murmur of concerned voices. Sergeant Henderson looked up sharply, his military training warring with his desperation. Fraternizing with the enemy was against regulations, but regulations seemed meaningless when his nephew's widow lay unconscious and possibly dying in his arms. "No," he admitted reluctantly, "and she needs help now." Running Bear nodded slowly, then turned and spoke rapidly in Shoshone to one of his companions, an elderly woman whose presence at the War Council had surprised many of the soldiers. She was small and weathered like an old piece of leather, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had seen much and forgotten nothing. "Bright Moon is skilled in the ways of bringing children into the world," Running Bear explained. "She has delivered many babies, both Shoshone and white. She can help your woman." The offer hung in the air, like smoke from a dying fire. Around them, soldiers shifted uncomfortably, their hands unconsciously moving closer to their weapons. The idea of allowing an Indian woman to treat a white woman, especially one carrying a child, went against every prejudice they'd been raised with. "Sir," Private Collins whispered urgently to Henderson, "regulations state that—" "Regulations can go to hell," Henderson snapped, his usual composure cracking under the strain. He looked directly at Chief Running Bear, reading the sincerity in the older man's face. "If your woman can help her, I'd be grateful." Running Bear spoke again to Bright Moon, who nodded and approached with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced countless emergencies. She knelt beside Martha and placed her weathered hands gently on the unconscious woman's forehead and abdomen, her touch both professional and surprisingly gentle. "The child moves restlessly," Bright Moon said in halting English, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "The mother is very weak. She needs warmth, food, and rest, but the baby may not wait for these things." As if summoned by her words, Martha's eyes fluttered open. The first thing she saw was the circle of faces above her, some familiar, some strange, and one that belonged to an elderly Indian woman whose dark eyes held unexpected kindness. Panic flashed across her features as the reality of her situation came flooding back. "It's all right," Sergeant Henderson said quickly, his voice as gentle as he could make it. "You're safe now. This woman is going to help you." Martha tried to sit up, but a sharp contraction seized her abdomen, causing her to cry out in pain. The sound was raw and desperate, carrying across the assembled crowd and causing several of the younger soldiers to look away in discomfort. "The baby is coming," Bright Moon announced matter-of-factly. "We must move her inside, to a warm place with clean blankets and hot water." The practical requirements of the situation began to override the cultural tensions. Sergeant Henderson looked toward the fort's buildings, calculating distances and options. "My quarters are closest," he decided. "Collins, get some men to help carry her. And find Mrs. Patterson, tell her what's happening." As the soldiers moved to organize assistance, Chief Running Bear stepped closer to Henderson. "My woman will need sage and other herbs. Some grow near the stream, even in this cold season. I can send my warriors to gather what is needed." The offer was both practical and symbolic, a gesture of cooperation that went far beyond the failed negotiations they had been conducting. Henderson studied the chief's face, seeing not the savage enemy that army reports described, but a man who understood the sanctity of new life, regardless of the color of the mother's skin. "Why?" Henderson asked quietly. "Why help us?" Running Bear's expression grew distant for a moment, as if he were looking into a past that held its own sorrows. "I once had a wife who died giving birth to our son. The child lived only 3 days." His voice carried no self-pity, only the weight of old grief accepted and transformed into wisdom. Perhaps if there had been help then— He didn't finish the thought, but his meaning was clear. Another contraction seized Martha, stronger this time, and her cry of pain galvanized everyone into action. Soldiers and Shoshone warriors alike moved with sudden purpose, their earlier antagonism temporarily forgotten in the face of the ancient drama of birth that transcended all cultural boundaries. As they carefully lifted Martha to carry her into the fort, she caught Chief Running Bear's eye. Despite her pain and fear, she managed to whisper, "Thank you." The chief nodded gravely. "We will see this through together," he replied, and in that moment an alliance was born that would challenge everything both communities believed about each other. Chapter 3. The Birth of Understanding. Inside Sergeant Henderson's modest quarters, the atmosphere was thick with tension and anticipation. Martha lay on the narrow military cot, her face pale and drawn as contractions came with increasing frequency. Bright Moon had taken charge with quiet authority, her weathered hands moving efficiently as she prepared for the birth. Mrs. Patterson, the fort's laundress and the closest thing they had to a midwife, had arrived with clean linens and hot water, her initial skepticism about the Indian woman's presence gradually giving way to respect for her obvious skill. "The baby is eager to join this world," Bright Moon observed, checking Martha's progress with practiced hands. "But it is not positioned well. We must turn it or both mother and child will be lost." Outside, the November wind had picked up, rattling the wooden shutters and whistling through the gaps in the log walls. The sound seemed to echo the uncertainty that gripped everyone present. Chief Running Bear stood just outside the door with Sergeant Henderson, both men bound by the universal anxiety of those who could only wait while women faced the ancient battle of bringing life into the world. "Your warriors found the herbs?" Henderson asked, grateful for something practical to discuss. Running Bear nodded, holding up a small leather pouch. "Willow bark for pain, sage for cleansing, and red raspberry leaf to strengthen the birthing muscles. Bright Moon knows their uses better than any white doctor." The statement would have been considered blasphemous by most frontier soldiers, but Henderson had seen enough in his years on the frontier to know that survival often meant setting aside prejudice in favor of practical wisdom. Through the thin walls, they could hear Martha's labored breathing punctuated by occasional cries of pain. Inside the room, Bright Moon was speaking softly to Martha in a mixture of English and Shoshone, her voice carrying a hypnotic quality that seemed to ease some of the younger woman's fear. "You must trust me now," she said, her dark eyes meeting Martha's frightened blue ones. "I have helped many babies come safely into this world. Your child wants to live. I can feel its strong spirit, but you must be brave for both of you." Martha nodded weakly, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. "I don't want to die," she whispered. "This baby is all I have left of Thomas." "You will not die," Bright Moon said with quiet conviction, "but you must fight. When I tell you to push, you must give everything you have, even when it feels impossible." Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered her share of babies but never under such unusual circumstances, found herself watching the Indian woman's techniques with growing admiration. There was something in Bright Moon's approach, a combination of spiritual confidence and practical skill, that went beyond anything she had learned from the fort's previous doctors. As another powerful contraction seized Martha, Bright Moon placed her hands on the distended belly and began to apply gentle but firm pressure, slowly working to reposition the baby. Martha's scream pierced the night air, carrying beyond the quarters to where the two groups of men waited in their uneasy alliance. "Easy, girl," Mrs. Patterson murmured, taking Martha's hand. "You're doing fine. Just breathe like she tells you." The hours stretched on with agonizing slowness. Outside, some of Running Bear's warriors had built a small fire and were keeping vigil alongside the fort's soldiers, an unprecedented scene that would have been unthinkable just days before. The shared concern for the life struggling to be born had created a temporary bridge across the cultural divide that separated their peoples. Just after midnight, when the wind had died to a whisper and the stars shone cold and bright above the Wyoming Territory, Martha's strength began to fail. Her contractions were becoming weaker, and Bright Moon's expression grew increasingly grave. "The mother grows tired," she said quietly to Mrs. Patterson. "We must help the baby come now, or we will lose them both." At that moment, Chief Running Bear appeared in the doorway, his weathered face showing deep concern. "How does she fare?" "Not well," Bright Moon admitted in Shoshone, then switched to English for Mrs. Patterson's benefit. "I need help from the spirits of our grandmothers." What happened next would be talked about in both communities for years to come. Bright Moon began to sing, a low rhythmic chant in the Shoshone language that seemed to fill the small room with an otherworldly presence. Her voice rose and fell like the wind across the prairie, calling on ancient wisdom and the protective spirits of women who had faced this same battle across countless generations. Mrs. Patterson later swore that she felt something change in the room during that song, a shift in the very air that seemed to give Martha new strength. The young widow's eyes opened wider, and when the next contraction came, she bore down with renewed determination. "Now," Bright Moon commanded. "Push now with all your heart." Martha's cry of effort merged with the older woman's chant, creating a sound that spoke of the fundamental struggle between life and death that had played out in countless births since the beginning of time. And then, suddenly, the room filled with a new sound, the strong, angry wail of a newborn baby announcing its arrival to the world. "A son," Bright Moon announced, her weathered face breaking into a smile as she lifted the squirming infant. "A strong son who will grow to be a bridge between worlds." Chapter 4. The chief's promised dawn was breaking over Fort Bridger when Chief Running Bear first held the baby in his arms. The infant had been cleaned and wrapped in soft blankets that Mrs. Patterson had provided, his tiny face peaceful now after his dramatic entrance into the world. Martha, exhausted but alive, watched with wonder as the Shoshone leader cradled her son with the gentle expertise of a man who had once been a father himself. "He has the look of a survivor," Running Bear observed, his deep voice soft with emotion as he studied the baby's features. "Strong lungs, good color. He will face many challenges in this world, but he has already shown his fighting spirit." The scene was unprecedented in the history of Fort Bridger, a Shoshone war chief holding a white man's child, while soldiers and warriors maintained their vigil outside. Word of the night's events had spread through both communities, creating ripples of curiosity, concern, and in some cases, outright hostility. Sergeant Henderson stood nearby, his own emotions in turmoil as he watched this unexpected tableau. The baby was his nephew's son, the last connection to his brother's memory. Yet here he was witnessing the child's first moments in the arms of a man his military training had taught him to consider an enemy. "He needs a name," Martha said weakly from her bed, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with determination. "Thomas would have wanted him to have a strong name." Running Bear's eyes met hers across the small room. "In my people's tradition, a child born during times of great change and with the help of both worlds should carry a name that reflects his unique path." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "But the naming must come from his mother." Martha struggled to sit up slightly, her gaze moving between the baby in the chief's arms and her brother-in-law's concerned face. "Thomas always talked about bridges," she said thoughtfully. "How the railroad was building bridges to connect distant places, how people needed bridges to understand each other." She looked directly at Running Bear. "Without your help, both your woman's skill and your kindness, my son would not be alive. I want him to remember that." "Thomas Bridge Henderson," she announced with growing strength in her voice. "Bridge, because he was born through the kindness of two peoples coming together." A murmur of approval came from Bright Moon, who had been quietly gathering her herbal remedies. She spoke rapidly in Shoshone to Running Bear, who nodded solemnly before responding in English. "She says the spirits spoke truly in their choice of this time and place for his birth. A child born between worlds will grow to understand both." He looked down at the infant again, his expression growing serious. "But there is something else we must discuss." The weight in his tone brought immediate attention from everyone in the room. Sergeant Henderson stepped closer, his military instincts alert to potential complications. "The council meeting was not going well before the child's birth interrupted it," Running Bear continued. My people need safe passage through this territory for winter hunting, or we will starve before spring. Your soldiers have been ordered to prevent this. The situation remains difficult. The reality of their circumstances came flooding back. Despite the miraculous events of the night, the fundamental conflicts that had brought them together remained unresolved. The temporary alliance forged in the crisis of childbirth could easily dissolve in the harsh light of political realities. "What are you saying?" Henderson asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I am saying that what happened here tonight, this cooperation, this shared concern for life, it must not be forgotten when we return to our separate worlds." Running Bear's gaze swept the room, taking in Martha, the baby, Mrs. Patterson, and the sergeant. "This child will grow up in a world where Shoshone and white settlers must find ways to live together, or both will suffer." Martha found the strength to speak again. "You saved both our lives. If there's anything I can do—" Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, the baby still peaceful in his arms. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of a man making a decision that would affect many lives. "I make you this promise, Martha Henderson. This child, Bridge, he will always have a place among my people if he needs one, and you, as his mother, will always be welcome at our fires." He looked at Sergeant Henderson. "But there is something I ask in return." "Name it," Henderson replied without hesitation. "Help me convince your commanders that cooperation serves everyone better than conflict. The winter will be hard for all of us. My people know where game is plentiful, where shelter can be found in the worst storms. Your people have supplies and medical knowledge that could save lives. Together we might all survive what's coming." The proposal was radical by frontier standards. Cooperation between the army and Indian tribes was virtually unheard of, especially in formal terms. But as Henderson looked at his nephew's son cradled peacefully in the arms of a Shoshone chief, he began to see possibilities that military manuals had never taught him to consider. "The colonel won't like it," he said slowly, "but after what I've seen tonight—" He straightened his shoulders with military bearing. "I'll speak for you, Chief. I'll tell them how you helped save my family." Outside, the morning sun was painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and pink. The wind had died completely, and smoke rose straight up from the chimneys of the fort's buildings. It was going to be a beautiful day, despite the approaching winter. As Running Bear carefully transferred the baby back to his mother's arms, he spoke one final time. "Remember this night when the child grows old enough to understand. Tell him that he came into this world through the hands of both peoples, and that his very existence proves we are not so different as we sometimes believe." Martha nodded, tears streaming down her face as she held her son close. "I will tell him every day," she promised, "and I will tell him that Chief Running Bear was the first man to hold him, and that without your kindness, he would never have drawn breath." The chief nodded gravely, then turned to leave. At the doorway he paused and looked back one final time. "When spring comes, bring the child to our camp. Let him hear the songs of both his worlds." And with that promise hanging in the morning air, Chief Running Bear walked out into the dawn, leaving behind a changed fort and a baby whose very existence would challenge the assumptions of everyone who met him. Chapter 5. Bridges Built and Futures Forged. 3 months had passed since Bridge Henderson's dramatic birth, and the winter of 1875-76 proved to be one of the harshest in memory. The cooperation that had begun in Sergeant Henderson's quarters that November night had evolved into something unprecedented in the Wyoming Territory, a formal alliance between Fort Bridger and Chief Running Bear's band of Shoshone. Martha stood at the window of her new quarters, watching as her brother-in-law supervised a joint patrol returning from the eastern ranges. Soldiers in blue uniforms rode alongside Shoshone warriors, their horses' breath creating clouds of vapor in the frigid air. In her arms, baby Bridge gurgled contentedly, his bright blue eyes so much like his father's, taking in the world with the fearless curiosity that had marked him from birth. The arrangement hadn't come easily. Colonel Whitman had initially been furious at what he called Henderson's unauthorized fraternization with hostiles, but when the first blizzard hit in December and trapped a supply wagon 20 miles from the fort, it was Running Bear's warriors who knew the sheltered valleys where the men and horses could survive. When scarlet fever broke out among the fort's children in January, it was Bright Moon's herbal remedies that broke the fevers when conventional medicine failed. Each crisis had reinforced the wisdom of cooperation, and gradually even the most skeptical soldiers began to see the Shoshone not as enemies to be feared, but as neighbors whose knowledge of the land, could mean the difference between life and death. "He's getting bigger every day," came a familiar voice from behind her. Martha turned to see Chief Running Bear entering the room, his usual dignity softened by the gentle smile he reserved for Bridge. Over the past months, he had become a regular visitor, taking his role as the child's unofficial Shoshone grandfather seriously. "Bright Moon says he'll be walking before the summer ends," Martha replied, shifting Bridge in her arms as the baby reached toward the chief with eager hands. "He recognizes your voice already." Running Bear accepted the infant with practiced ease, the sight that had once shocked the entire fort now as natural as sunrise. Bridge settled against the chief's broad chest with obvious contentment, his tiny fist grasping at the beaded necklace that Running Bear wore. "The council meeting went well?" Martha asked, noting the satisfaction in the older man's expression. "Better than I dared hope," Running Bear confirmed. "Your Colonel Whitman has agreed to recommend our arrangement to his superiors in Washington. The shared patrols, the trading agreements, the medical cooperation, all of it will continue through the spring." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "There is other news as well." Martha felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Good news in the frontier territories was often followed quickly by challenges that tested everyone's resolve. "Sergeant Henderson received orders yesterday," Running Bear continued. "He's being transferred to Fort Laramie in June, promoted to company commander." The news hit Martha like a physical blow. William had become her anchor in this new life, the bridge between her past and her uncertain future. The thought of losing his protection and support left her feeling adrift. "I know what you're thinking," Running Bear said gently, his weathered hand reaching out to touch her shoulder. "But remember what I promised the night Bridge was born. You and the child will always have a place among my people. That offer stands whether your brother-in-law is here or not." Martha looked out the window again, watching the mixed patrol disappear into the pine trees that lined the fort's perimeter. The idea of living permanently among the Shoshone was both frightening and oddly appealing. Over the winter months, she had learned much of their language and customs, finding in their communal approach to child-rearing a support system she had never known in her own culture. "There's something else," she said quietly, having wrestled with the decision for weeks. "I've been thinking about what to do when William leaves. Mrs. Patterson thinks I should go back east, find a husband to provide for Bridge and me." Running Bear's expression remained neutral, but she could see the question in his dark eyes. "But Bridge was born here, between two worlds," she continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "Running away to some eastern city would be denying half of who he is. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "I think I've gotten used to the frontier. Going back to drawing rooms and social calls seems smaller somehow." The chief nodded approvingly. "And what does your heart tell you to do?" Martha looked down at her son, who was contentedly playing with Running Bear's necklace, his innocent joy unmarked by the cultural complexities that surrounded his existence. In 3 months, he had been blessed by both a Methodist minister and a Shoshone medicine man, had been sung to sleep by lullabies in English and Shoshone, and had been loved by people from both worlds who saw in him hope for a better future. "I want to stay," she said finally, "not just at the fort but here in this territory. Bridge needs to grow up knowing both sides of his heritage. And maybe," she paused, struck by the audacity of her own thoughts, "maybe there's work for someone like me, someone who can speak both languages, who understands both cultures." Running Bear's eyes lit up with understanding. "You're thinking of the other trading posts, the settlements that are growing along the railroad line. They will need people who can help smooth the relations between whites and Indians." "Exactly," Martha said, feeling excitement building as the possibilities became clearer. "With the territory growing so fast, there will be more situations like ours, times when cooperation could prevent conflict, when understanding could save lives." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Sergeant Henderson entered, his face showing a mixture of pride and concern that Martha had come to recognize as his standard expression when dealing with family matters. "The supply wagon from South Pass City just arrived," he announced, "and they brought some interesting news. Seems word of our arrangement here has reached the territorial governor. He's sending an official to investigate, but from what the driver heard, it's not necessarily a bad thing." Running Bear and Martha exchanged glances. Government attention could mean either validation of their efforts or interference that could destroy everything they had built. "There's more," Henderson continued. "The driver also brought a letter for you, Martha, from back east." Martha's heart skipped as she accepted the envelope. The return address showed it was from her late husband's sister in Philadelphia, the aunt she had written to months ago, seeking advice about her situation. With trembling fingers, she opened the letter and read quickly, her expression changing from anxiety to amazement to something approaching joy. "What is it?" Henderson asked, unable to contain his curiosity. "Aunt Margaret says she's been corresponding with a missionary society," Martha said, her voice filled with wonder. "They're looking for someone to establish a school here in the territory, someone who could teach both white and Indian children, help prepare them for the changing world they'll inherit." The implications hung in the air like morning mist, full of possibility and challenge in equal measure. Running Bear spoke first. "Bridge would be among the first students in such a school, and it would give you a way to support yourself and the boy without depending on anyone else," Henderson added, his military practicality warring with his obvious pride in his sister-in-law's determination. Martha looked around the room, at the baby in Running Bear's arms, at the mixed patrol visible through the window, at the life she had built from the ashes of tragedy. 6 months ago she had arrived at Fort Bridger as a desperate widow with nowhere else to turn. Now she was contemplating a future that would have been unimaginable in her old life. "I need to write back to Philadelphia," she said with growing conviction, "and to the territorial governor. If we're going to change how people see each other in this territory, we need to start with the children." As if understanding the significance of the moment, Bridge chose that instant to reach up and grab both his mother's finger and Running Bear's weathered hand, bringing them together in his tiny grasp. The gesture was so perfectly symbolic that all 3 adults laughed, the sound carrying through the thin walls and drawing smiles from the soldiers and civilians outside. Later that evening, as Martha sat writing letters by lamplight while Bridge slept peacefully in his cradle, she could hear the sounds of the fort settling into its nighttime routine, but mixed with the familiar calls of the sentries and the stamp of horses in the stable, she could also hear something new, the sound of Shoshone voices joining with those of the soldiers around the evening fires, sharing stories and songs that bridged the gap between their peoples. Outside her window, the first stars of spring were appearing in the clear Wyoming sky, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, not in loneliness, but in acknowledgement of the changing times that would reshape the frontier forever. Martha smiled as she sealed her letters, knowing that her son would grow up in a world where cooperation was possible, where bridges could be built between even the most different of peoples, and where one small life could represent hope for countless others yet to come. The story of Bridge Henderson was just beginning, but already it was clear that his birth had changed more than just one small fort in the Wyoming Territory. It had planted the seeds of understanding that would grow into something larger than anyone could have imagined on that cold November night when a Shoshone chief first held a white man's child and promised that the future could be different from the past.